As we leave March of 2024, I want to leave you with two interviews. One about luck, serendipity. The other about making it happen. Maybe they're both about that, really. But to remind yourself about luck, to remind yourself about serendipity, and to remind yourself about how to make it happen, we need that every day. I hope you enjoy. When I saw the title for my guest today, his newest book, when I saw that title, I thought to myself, awesome, 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 awesome. Because there's a word in the title of my guest's new book, my guest, Christian Busch, a word that I just love. The title of the book, The Serendipity Mindset, the art and science of creating good luck. Serendipity is the only reason I am here. Serendipity has got to be one of the greatest words in the history of the English language. It's fabulous. That magic something that can just happen in an unexpected way if you're ready and prepared for it. Now, that might not be the exact definition, but it's kind of my working definition. Because let's face it, even if you think what I'm about to say is wrong, you're wrong. Good luck isn't just chance. It can be learned. It can be leveraged. That's where my guest today, Christian, goes. How do you find the good luck? How do you make your luck? What do the best do to get the luck? It's definitely technique. Now, of course, when we use the term luck, well, yeah, you can't control it, but you can put yourself on the right side of serendipity. You can put yourself in a position to benefit. Again, that's technique. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with my guest today, Christian Busch. Almost everything in my life is related to serendipity. That means for me, I don't have a plan. That means for me, I'm looking for connections. I'm looking for things that are interesting. I'm following maybe a path that doesn't make any sense. I'm very curious. And literally, I could trace everything that I've done in my career, books, a film, etc. This podcast is all based on serendipity. Every person that I've met is based on serendipity. On the flip side, I know from experience when I talk to most people, the vast majority of individuals, I'm going to guess even 99% or more, don't think this way. They think, what did my parents tell me to do? What am I supposed to do? What does the school system tell me to do? When I'm finished all that, I will then get the job I'm supposed to do. I'll get the gold watch I'm supposed to get, and I'll die when I'm supposed to die. Literally, people go through their life like this without ever understanding the word serendipity, yeah?
Absolutely. And I think that's coming from Germany, where this is exactly the way you grow up. I can completely relate to that idea that at the end of the day, we try to plan everything out and we try to map everything out, but then the unexpected happens, right? And it shapes essentially our life. The way we meet the love of our life, the way we meet our co-founder, the way we invent things, up to 50% of innovations coming from that, and inventions. It's exactly this. And I think that's what I find so interesting, that once we realize that some people like you do it intuitively, and intuitively kind of, in a way, see how you can turn the unexpected into positive things, essentially then we can learn what the patterns behind it is and really kind of develop this science-based framework for turning it into a positive outcome.
Let me keep it at Germany for a second. So most people, if they've never been, and I've only been briefly through Berlin many years ago, but if most people think of Germany, they think of precision, they think of engineering, they think perhaps of war stuff, but they think of very competent people, very precise. You would think in your mind, to get to have that level of capability, there's a lot of training, there's a lot of schooling, there's a lot of follow the rules to some degree, I would guess. Where does serendipity fit for a German growing up?
It's actually something where it's also how, if you look at business schools and others, they do the same thing. They try to instill us with this idea of there is some kind of plan that we have to follow, some kind of business plan, and other things. It's interesting because growing up in Germany and getting used to these kind of different rules, and so I've always been trying to push a couple of boundaries as a kid as well. And I think a lot of people around me as well. And what happens there is that I think one thing I've realized on this journey of studying serendipity and living it is that a lot of times actually we're trying to airbrushing serendipity out of our stories because we try to make it a planning or a control story. We try to say, this is how I planned it and this is how I did it. But a lot of times this is not how life happens. I think this is the interesting thing also where it fits in is to say, hey, look, at the end of the day, yes, there's all this kind of planning we do, but actually what is much more effective is in a world of uncertainty that we're facing at the moment, especially, we need to build this muscle for the unexpected that allows us to actually navigate this world. And so it's in a way complementing this old idea that, hey, yes, we have to have some kind of sense of direction, but at the same time, we need to be open to the unexpected, because to your point, that's where the real interesting things happen.
But we're asking the vast majority of the population that are perhaps afraid of exploration, afraid of taking chances that might take them out of being aligned with their family and friends, and asking them to do something different, to think a different way, to imagine. I mean, look, for example, I think actually, gosh, it's been a long time. It's been over 20 years since I've been to Germany. I remember the first time that I went, and it was to Berlin. I was going to a conference on trading. I didn't know anybody there, but I knew I needed to get to that conference because there was going to be people there that I might meet. Literally with not much money, not knowing a soul, I got on a plane and went to Berlin and didn't know a soul. It was the chance to get there, to connect, to maybe meet one of those people I thought might be there. And I was willing, that felt completely normal to me. I talk to people all the time. That's not normal thinking. I know I'm weird. That's serendipity thinking, right?
The interesting thing is I started out with this journey thinking, oh, great, I write this book and kind of try to understand practices. And then those people who do it already have a couple of more tools to do more with it. But what I realized is that the actual real mindset change comes with those people who might not yet believe in it or who might not yet feel this is their kind of way of life. For example, I mean, I lived in London for 10 years. I was at the LSE before, where I would be for 10 years in an environment that is essentially focused very much on what we just talked about, the idea that people have relatively okay lives and they plan things. What I found fascinating is when interacting with people who said, well, do we actually need serendipity in our lives? And we made a deal, essentially. We said, you know what? Let's do a couple of small changes in your daily practices. So for example, let's do something like next time someone asks you this dreaded, what do you do question, essentially answer with a couple of hooks. Just say, I'm in tech entrepreneurship, but what I'm really excited about is reading the philosophy of science and playing the piano. What you do here is you're giving people 3 hooks where they could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I just started hosting piano matinees. Why don't you come by? Or such a coincidence. I just started a philosophy of science club. The point here is by making small behavioral changes, then you can integrate serendipity into your lives. And the idea there was to say, if you do that with people who are not used to it, for example, a couple of my colleagues, they came back after 2 weeks and they're like, oh my God, I didn't know life can be so joyful. I didn't know there could be these kind of things that I always thought would be anxiety enhancing, which is change, which is things that are unexpected. But essentially, I didn't know that this can actually be something that's on my side. And I think that is the beauty of serendipity, I think also in the way that you've described, that in a way, serendipity means we can create more meaningful accidents, but also we can make accidents more meaningful. And I think in a world that is so fast changing, that had a lot of crises, seeing something in the unexpected that we can derive meaning from. I had COVID in March, and it's these kind of periods where like, wow, this is a tough period where essentially you try to find meaning in that. And I reread Viktor Frankl, this wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning. And it's really this idea that at the end of the day, when we start finding meaning in every situation and every conversation, it starts happening that we see potential dots we might not otherwise see.
I might have a different take on this than you. You might look at this as more iterative, as a way to help people that are already in an established existence and they can make small changes. I look at your work and saying it is a knife thrust into the chest to remind people they have gone down a, excuse me for saying this, a shitty path. Here's where I want to go with this. You mentioned the students, okay? And I'm curious, I think I know the answer, but let's face it, the vast majority of students that are getting into the best schools around this world absolutely do not live serendipity in any way, shape, or form. Because to get into those best schools, they either have to be born with 1600 SAT skill, or they have to spend every waking hour in some kind of like sausage conveyor, Pink Floyd The Wall conveyor belt, learning every step of the way in a pre-programmed way to get to the university, to get out of the university, to get a job. So the question becomes, really, we are facing a situation where if you want to get people over the serendipity hump, doesn't it really require kind of rethinking K through 12 and rethinking college, et cetera? They've got a big burden to go ahead and get to the point where they can understand serendipity from your perspective.
That's essentially exactly why I think this is also systematic and a systemic question, right? In terms of saying, how do we think about both the question of what success means? Does it mean we go a kind of predefined career path and we can know everything and assume we can know everything and put people into that mindset? Or do we say at the end of the day, we need to give people the life skill to be able to cultivate serendipity and essentially let them also discover what could be best for them, what is most aligned to them, what is something that really works for them. Because a lot of times, to your point, we put people into boxes because that is essentially, quote unquote, the easiest way to, as a parent, for example, you think is the easiest way to enable your child to go through a certain kind of good life. But that depends on our definition of a good life. As you say, a lot of people might look back after 50 years and say, yes, I followed all the steps that I was supposed to follow, but maybe that wasn't really me. And I've always been fascinated by these kind of questions around deathbed regrets, that people don't regret that they were not as productive or whatever. They usually regret that they haven't lived a life up to what they could really have done, who they could have been, and true to their values. And I think the beauty of serendipity is that it allows us to essentially see the potentiality of who we could be. And I completely agree with you that the interesting thing about this is to say, how do we essentially design education systems, companies? So I do a lot of work with companies, especially, and with educational institutions around the question of how do we bring curricula into a direction where we realize that at the end of the day, it's almost like a Socratic approach, where it's more about getting people to learn to ask the right questions, because that then puts us onto trajectories that helps us more, but also assessing people differently, not only assessing them based on exactly these kind of memorizing things that in a fast-changing world where you can retrieve information from everywhere are not the key skills you need for tomorrow. The key skills you need for tomorrow are the skills that are in that kind of serendipity mindset around seeing something in the unexpected, but also, again, having the kind of emotional capacity, overcoming a couple of the things that hold us back to really also act on those kind of new opportunities.
You mentioned being put in the box, but let's face it, a lot of people put themselves in the box as well. A point here that you make in your work, you talk about, I'm not sure if it was you or someone else or just an anecdote. You talked about being, I think, a teenager and lots of energy and nowhere to go. And that really struck me because I was thinking, well, okay, what was I like at 16? I was a lot of energy and nowhere to go. I was the consummate skeptic. I was like, okay, if you're telling me something is A, you better be able to prove that it's A, because if you want me to believe A is true on faith alone, that doesn't work. And I think what's really interesting is we get to this kind of big philosophical point about why people might have a hard time with serendipity. It goes back a long time because, you know, that kid who has a lot of energy and nowhere to go, a lot of adults might know that that kid has something. They might recognize that that kid is not willing to accept the system. They might recognize that that kid wants to break out. But I'm firmly convinced of this. In society, family, friends, parents, brothers, sisters, if there's somebody who's kind of poking out and breaking out, they'll put him down. They'll hold him back. A lot of it is just, frankly, jealousy, because they detect in that person a lack of fear that perhaps they have. So instead of embracing that person's lack of fear, they just want to bring them into their circle of fear, so to speak.
It reminded me of Ken Robinson, who used to have this beautiful line around how education, in a way, the education system gets us out of creativity a lot of times, because in a way, creativity relies on this idea of being a bit more comfortable with things that are new, that are not there yet. I find it interesting because at the end of the day, if you think about some of our studies that are around people who, you know, run big companies or have like our wonderful entrepreneurs, so essentially people who are extremely inspiring and purpose-driven, when you look at the patterns behind this, a lot of times they had these kind of periods in their life where people might have considered them to be a bit crazy or a bit different or a bit XYZ, because of exactly what you just mentioned, that in a way, I think we might a lot of times find comfort in having control of mapping everything out. But also a lot of times what you'll see is, of course, that some of us might have an illusion of control and might kind of grab onto this. And I think one of the interesting things that came with COVID, of course, is that I think COVID was an interesting reminder that at the end of the day, everything else, the unexpected happens all the time. And then what's interesting, of course, is that if you see breweries that become hand sanitizer companies, or if you look at how snow cannon businesses realize that they can use that for like literally sending disinfectants around. And the interesting thing is that that is exactly where I think that mindset becomes most important then, when you have necessity-based situations where it's not a nice to have anymore. It's in order to thrive in a world that is changing so fast, this is literally becoming the key skill. And I think we can learn a lot from these kind of positive deviants who, in a way, have always done that in some way. But to your point, maybe they've felt less anxiety about it. It still gives me anxiety when I look at ambiguity, when I look at fast changing things. It's imprinted in me that I think, oh my God, I got to do something with it. But I think what happens is once you reframe the world towards saying, oh, okay, not necessarily what is the problem here, but what is actually still in this situation that I can do with it, then actually it's fascinating to see that most situations in life, when you look back, actually turn into something positive in the long run. And I think that is what I'm most fascinated by. Like, how do we reframe that away from anxiety to something that becomes our ally?
A way that I like to think about this, you've got to be curious without expecting a return. And I got to tell you, from my personal experience, the vast majority of people, well over 90%, cannot take action unless they know the return in advance. They just can't do it. It's a fascinating mind block. I mean, for example, I've said this many times in this podcast. I'll repeat it for you because you might not have heard it. Right now, I'm talking to you from Saigon. I never expected to be here, but I ended up here randomly on an Asian trip, and I realized, well, gosh, this can work. Do you know how many people in the last 7 or 8 years actually feel comfortable coming to a place like Saigon, especially Americans? They're not comfortable at all because they've seen too many Platoons, Rambos, Full Metal Jackets, and Apocalypse Nows, Da 5 Bloods, the new one, and they just are petrified. You get to a completely different side of the planet. I mean, I'm actually pretty close to Sri Lanka, frankly speaking, but you get to a different side of the planet and you realize, oh, wow, I just learned all kinds of new stuff. I met all kinds of new people, and all of those fears that my friends and family still have are unfounded. But you can't explain it to them because they're so damn afraid to even make the journey. It's a fascinating wall. So you end up having a life that you can't even share with people you know because they're stuck in a box.
The fascinating thing there, I feel, becomes then, how do we bridge those two worlds, right? The world in which we grow up, in which we feel that maybe there is a certain kind of dominant logic almost of how we are supposed to live. And then to exactly your point, the kind of more out there, curiosity-led world. I found that fascinating because living between those worlds, one thing that I found really interesting, and that comes to what we talked about earlier, to take away this kind of big gap, what are the small things that we can put in place that people ease into it? And I think we've tried that in a couple of the universities that I'm involved with in terms of really saying, like, okay, we have people coming from different cultural backgrounds where they are used to that kind of planning mentality. But again, by very small behavioral changes, they become interested in that kind of idea. Oh, actually, there is something in that curiosity. There is something in that creativity. And then once they start, it kind of becomes this amplification of it. And people like literally get joyful about it and tell their parents about it. And then first there's kind of skepticism, and then they try it. And it's just fascinating to me. And I think that was also one of the reasons why a lot of our work has focused on questions such as, how do you directly develop exercises around it? How do you work out your muscle? Because at the end of the day, it's one thing to have it directly. People like us have it directly as a philosophy of life, as a life experience that is with us. Someone who might not have it might want to ease into it in terms of doing a couple of smaller things day to day, but then literally say, like, after a month, okay, this is what happened. And that's why I'm a big fan, for example, of a serendipity journal, where you just kind of start and write down, which conversations do I have today? How could I ask questions slightly differently than usual? When someone talks, how can I think about how does this relate to things I'm interested in or someone else is interested in? How can I train myself to connect the dots? And once we ease into this, I think it gets interesting because we see how much there is in terms of when we might be bored by certain conversations. Usually we can literally revive every conversation, every situation. And I think that kind of joy that comes from that. And I've literally had people tell me, like, I got back my enthusiasm for life. And I think that is also what you mentioned. This kind of, how do we get that curiosity back?
I think one of the issues, though, that is really terrible with COVID is the lack of travel, because I think serendipity, look at the origin story with Serendip coming from Sri Lanka, that origin right there. But I think that there's probably no greater way that one can find serendipity than moving around the chessboard of the globe. Because when you start to do that, things really happen. What's really interesting is travelers kind of do common things. So your chances of bumping into strange, interesting people really go up when you start to travel. I'll give another serendipity example, which I've talked before on this podcast. I was in the business class lounge at 12 a.m., Saigon, Vietnam, a few years ago, sitting with my parents, just waiting for our red-eye flight to Tokyo. And some guy taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "Hey, can I share your power outlet with you?" And I looked at him and I knew exactly who it was. No one else in the business class lounge of 100 people knew who it was, but I knew who it was. 6 inches away from his face. And I said, "Sure, as long as you give me a selfie with you." Now, I start taking a selfie with this kind of chubby, gray-haired guy with a beard. And my father's 2 meters away and he's looking at me going, "This is weird." It was Steve Wozniak who founded Apple. But these serendipity things only happen if you're kind of like moving and grooving and keeping your eyes open. And that kind of stuff happens for, I think, so many travelers. I'm sure you've got a story of something that's crazy happened to you. And the thing is you talk about this in your work too, is that you can kind of keep your eyes open. And then when it happens, you've got to be in tune to it. Then when you're in tune to it and it happens, you got to figure out to do something with it. So in like 2 or 3 seconds, I realized the only thing I could safely get from Steve Wozniak without being some kind of fanboy was just to say, "Hey, can I have a selfie?" And I knew he would laugh and say, "Sure," because I was letting him share the outlet. That's serendipity.
So to your point around travels, that this is exactly something where some of our work at the moment is actually thinking about how do you replicate that travel experience into your own life? For example, let's say, beautiful thing about a 30-day travel usually is you have all these new experiences and these kind of potential encounters with new people. How do you take something like this and build it into your day-to-day at the moment? Maybe every day you go through a different street, go into a different coffee shop, talk with different people in the grocery, whatever it is, building something in that tries to replicate as much as possible from this. But also to your point, and I think the more important fundamental thing behind it is really this idea, how do we open ourselves up to this kind of smart luck? There's a lot of amazing studies on creating luck actually for yourself. One of my favorites actually is this experiment where they take one person who self-identifies as extremely lucky and someone who self-identifies as extremely unlucky. They tell them, you know what, walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, order a coffee and sit down. That's it. What they don't tell them is that there's a 5-pound note in front of the coffee shop, and there's only one empty seat in the coffee shop where there's this extremely successful businessman next to it who can make big ideas happen. They also don't tell them there's a lot of hidden cameras across the street. They tell them, well, do it. The lucky person walks down the street, sees the 5-pound note, goes inside, orders the coffee, sits down next to the businessman, has a wonderful conversation, exchanges business card, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that. Now, the unlucky person steps over the 5-pound note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, the other person's left, ignores the businessman, that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both of them, so how was your day? The lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, I made new friends, and we don't know if an opportunity came out of it, but wouldn't be unexpected. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And I think we all see that in our lives, the way we travel, the way we meet people, that we might have had exactly the same situation, but one of us created serendipity and the other didn't because we were open to it, but also we connect dots, we do something with it and so on.
You're talking about mindset as well, right? I mean, if you've got a faulty mindset, serendipity is never going to happen for you.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, I guess, also about overcoming biases, because all of us have biases one way or the other. And I think one of the major biases a lot of us have is that we constantly underestimate that the unexpected actually happens all the time. If you have slightly erratic hand movements like I do, it's very probable that I will drop a coffee or I will drop something in the grocery store and so on. And if I now set myself up and if I am in a coffee shop, spill that coffee and there's that person I feel a connection with, do I have a line or something that I can use to say, hey, look, I'm so sorry, XYZ, maybe I can send you XYZ cleaning or you send me your cleaning bill, whatever it is. There's some kind of way then to prepare for these unexpected moments because we know that they happen. And that is really something, once we believe that they happen and know that they happen, we can set ourselves up for it and do more of it. But also then really, and I think that is something that comes a lot out of the work, is really that a lot of times we might hold ourselves back because we might not feel worthy of an opportunity. I mean, in one case, for example, this wonderful person who's involved in the restaurant business in London, we would have this conversation around how he had never had serendipity happen until he was 25 and afterwards all the time. And the thing that happened was that people would always, since he's like 20 or so, would always offer him opportunities because he has great energy. He's a great, smart person. And they would always say, hey, look, I want to introduce you to my brother who could employ you in XYZ. But he would always say, no, I'm okay here, because he essentially felt people like me are not supposed to do XYZ. He had this kind of experience where he realized, hey, look, I deserve this. And he went through this kind of journey with a couple of people who helped him kind of gain that self-confidence. But once he had that, now he started to act on these kind of opportunities that came unexpectedly from different people and different places. And so one of the reasons why I really like what you said at the beginning about the importance of the education system is really that this is not only about a kind of mindset in the sense of thinking about how we do XYZ better. It's about setting ourselves up in terms of feeling that we deserve having that kind of luck happen in our life, and then have the system that allows that actually to happen.
The education system is an entirely different debate. I think that's entirely broken all the way through K through college. The things that we're talking about today, let's just face it, we know they are not talked about K through 12. We know they're not talked about at university, not at any kind of scale and not in any kind of a way where it dents people. I mean, I salute you for going down the path to write about it and to try and bring awareness. I mean, that's the start, but I mean, it's a daunting task. I'll give you a hack I heard once. And as you're talking and we're going through this topic, I was thinking about this as a serendipity hack or rule. There's a guy, I think his name is David Gilmour. I'm not sure. I think his first name is David. He started Fiji Water. He's got this famous story. He came from a wealthy family, and his father said, as a youngster, maybe he was 18 or 20 or something, he said, look, here's the deal. I'll give you money for a business, or I'll give you money to travel. But if you choose the travel option, and I find out that you're traveling with anybody, if you're not traveling solo, if I find out you're traveling with anybody, the deal's off, you go home, it's over, no more traveling. You got to travel solo. You can probably already read my mind as to the reason why you want to travel solo and why, from a serendipity standpoint, that's probably so beneficial. But ultimately, the short answer is if you see this across, for anybody that travels, you see packs of people. And when you're with a pack of people, guess what you do? You're looking at the pack of people. You're not open to serendipity because you're focused on the friends and family, et cetera, et cetera. You go to a vacation in XYZ Asian country or XYZ European country, and if you're with friends and family, you come home, you've never met a damn soul.
That's a great example also, I feel, in terms of what is the discomfort we allow? Is it the discomfort of maybe meeting a stranger? Even if you're an extrovert person, it is kind of meeting new people, putting yourself into new situations and so on, obviously has a huge benefit. But one of the things that's interesting there also is if you look at serendipity also as that kind of process of really making sense out of things. In a way, if you are someone who probably has a lot of serendipity happen in their life, a lot of times we might also need someone who kind of helps us make sense out of it. So in my case, for example, I have a wonderful partner who I would have that kind of unexpectedness happen, but then I need some kind of reflection space. I need someone who actually makes sense out of it. It's interesting also the kind of people we go traveling with. Is it a groupthink type traveling, to your point? Is it a group where we stick with that group? We always hang out with them. We don't change how we think about the world. We don't see new things. Or are we traveling with someone who's similarly curious, who maybe even helps us connect dots, who helps us kind of see something? And I feel like that is so much about this idea that we all have people around us who seem a bit luckier than others. And really also associating with people or spending more time with people who seem to have a bit more luck, because it also, in a way, subtly trains us to look at the world in similar ways that actually make us also a bit more happy. So I'm in two minds there in terms of saying, on one hand, we certainly definitely want to not go into this group kind of thing. And I think it's a beautiful example to say, like, hey, look, go traveling solo to figure that out. And on the other hand, how do we find people around ourselves who are similarly curious, who can actually then even add to that and even create more luck with us because they are opening our eyes to new things we might not have seen yet, and we might not see.
Agree to disagree on this one, or at least I think that there's the initial level. I mean, we all fly alone, ultimately. We all die alone. We all end up alone. I mean, that's how it works. There can be if I listen to your logic, if I listen to your thinking, I can imagine, yes, you want to have those common thinkers, those common adventure seekers, those common serendipity seekers around you. But also there is for sure here a solo thing that has to take place, meaning I don't think anybody can just kind of like start down the serendipity path if they've not been going the serendipity path and say, well, let's do it as a team approach. There is some part of this that has to almost be the learning process, some kind of DNA rewiring that occurs solo. Then I can see your point where there can be some parallel processing and some friends and family that can help you along to kind of even get away from what I'm saying right there. This is about being an entrepreneur and your thinking. I mean, you can't take the word entrepreneur and serendipity and separate the two, can you?
Well, it's interesting. So 2 points to this. One is really to your earlier point. I mean, I'm a big believer in this kind of discipleship, really discipleships where you essentially say, at the end of the day, a lot of the things we're learning by ourselves, but also we learn it as teams, or we learn it as being with people on a journey. And if you look at how over centuries interesting learning happened, it's a lot of times through apprenticeship, no? And through really being around people who are able to convey something to each other. And so I feel there's a lot in there. But to your point, then the question always becomes, how do we keep an independence, this kind of entrepreneurial mindset that allows us to actually explore that for ourselves as well? And I think to your point, it's an interesting one. We just had on the nerdy academic side, we just had a longer review process where we went through kind of all these different types of concepts and how they relate to each other. And one of the things I found fascinating is if entrepreneurship is all about essentially seeing and exploiting opportunity, a lot of this is around serendipity and vice versa. It's like a Venn diagram where there is this overlap between how do we seek and exploit opportunity. I think where serendipity really comes in is to say, at the end of the day, yes, we want to exploit opportunity, but there's also so much about our own personal growth, our own personal potentiality, and what could be out there, in essentially really kind of creating that own luck, but also setting ourselves up for it in a way that allows us to do that over time. And it's like this beautiful Venn diagram that probably goes into and intersects with each other.
I'm not sure if some people listening might be going to where I'm about to go right now, and they're thinking, maybe they think that I'm talking about networking. Some of the examples I've used to kind of give back to you. I was thinking about the concept of networking and how most people think about it. Jamming into a hotel conference room and they're serving bad drinks and you stand around in a suit and you look at each other and maybe you get some business cards. And it's like, this is the standard operating procedure for the corporate world often. And before we started chatting, I was jotting down to myself kind of like what a definition of serendipity in my mind would be, contrasting to networking. Serendipity is networking on steroids inside the matrix. It's completely something that's supercharged beyond networking. And then the matrix part is you just don't know what the hell's going to happen. And you've got to be open to that. You've got to be open to absolutely insane stuff happening that you can never imagine. And if you're open to that, all of a sudden, the insane stuff that you could never imagine starts to happen every damn day almost.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, I guess, big fascination. That's why I'm so fascinated about it, because essentially networking to me, I've always been a big fan of developing meaningful relationships. And I think to me, when you go to these conferences and they have networking breaks or something, it sometimes gives me shivers because it's so over-focused, particular transactional kind of ideas, versus I think that the kind of networking you are alluding to is really kind of having this curiosity about learning someone new and then seeing what could happen in the moment and that potentiality that's in that. I find that fascinating because then networking becomes one part of the puzzle. And then there's so many other pieces. If you look at introverts, how they create a lot of serendipity, it might come by reading a book and then relating this to something they're excited about, or walking by a store and seeing something in the store. And there's very introvert ways of creating serendipity. But to your point, a lot of times the really kind of things on steroids happen when you are in particular kind of settings where other people also can connect the dots for you. And I think that's where it gets interesting. I don't know how you've experienced that in your life, but one thing I've certainly have happened a lot is that in a way, a lot of times serendipity happens to me because other people are bringing it to me because I've brought it to them in the past and vice versa. And so it's really this idea that in a way, when we're setting ourselves up for almost like a kindness dynamic where people want to connect dots for each other because essentially they feel goodwill towards the person, they feel gratefulness towards the person and so on, then it happens more. And so I think there's a lot in that idea that the way we interact with people and the way we allow other people also to have their own serendipity actually then brings a lot of serendipity also back to us.
I'll give you two examples that have happened to me. This is such a fun subject. Once again, I feel like my whole life is the word serendipity. Twice in the last 2 years, I was giving a speech. I understand everybody might not have a situation where they can give a speech in their career. And look, there was a certain point in time where I was never giving speeches. I never expected to be giving speeches in Asia. And this was not on my docket. This was just something that happened. But twice in the last 2 years, once in Hong Kong, once in Beijing, I gave presentations. And when I give presentations, you can probably guess I sound a little bit high octane like I do now. So you give the audience in 30 minutes something where hopefully they feel something. They feel something. And to me, as someone giving a speech or a presentation, it's like fishing. I don't know who the hell's in the audience most of the time. But I know if I'm at Hong Kong or if I know I'm in Beijing and I know I've been invited there and I'm giving a presentation, I'm making some assumptions. There could be some interesting people in those audiences. So the two times with me, I gave presentations and afterwards, kind of to your point, two different times, people came up to me. They ended up being one, a 77-year-old British guy, a vice chairman of a very large fund. We became buddies, communicate all the time still. The other guy is one of the most prominent political analyst or broadcasters, everyone would recognize his name, in the States. And he was kind of in Beijing on a low-key event. It was just so interesting that I only got to meet them is because I was just giving energy to the audience and they came up to me afterwards, which I think kind of is going to what your point is.
Absolutely. And it's a really interesting example because putting something out there, that energy being that content and other things, is exactly that kind of invitation. What I find fascinating is because sometimes you would have people who say, oh, but I don't have that kind of audience or I don't have that kind of platform. And that always reminds me of, so a lot of my work is with people who come from less privileged backgrounds, either in Kenya, in very impoverished areas, but also even in London's kind of less privileged kind of quarters and so on. And one of the things that we've started doing with people who don't have a network yet, who don't have a platform yet, some of them just coming out of prison, having a really rough kind of time finding jobs and everything else, is literally to say, hey, look, build your own audience by, for example, let's say there's an open event at the London School of Economics or RSA where there's this inspiring speaker. So let's say you're speaking, or there's a wonderful CEO speaking, or there's the president speaking, and there's 500 people in the audience. Now, the first thing you're doing is, after the talk is over, you energetically stand up so that they can't ignore you. Not too much, but in a way that, you know how people, when the moderator looks around, like they see the first person who like energetically stands up. So you're the first person who energetically stands up. And the way you ask the question is to say, thank you so very much for this extremely inspiring speech. It really resonated. So you make it all about the speaker. But then you bring in this half sentence that says, as someone who just went through XYZ transition, and so whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but just something that gives people a potential hook, some kind of something they can relate to. So as someone who just went through XYZ transition period, I was interested in your advice about XYZ. So again, you ask for advice, you make it completely about the speaker, but you build in this half sentence that's about other people saying, oh, actually, what always happens is after the speech, there's always 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people coming to the person who asked the questions and says, hey, this is so interesting. My brother, such a coincidence, he just went through a similar period. Or such a coincidence, we were just looking for someone like you. The point here is we give other people the opportunity to connect the dots for us because we just created our own audience. And I think that logic applies to so many other places and ideas, and to the logic you just mentioned. Once we start putting something out there in one way or the other, and the same applies to digital as well at the moment.
Just so I don't sound like some hoity-toity kind of guy who's giving speeches in Beijing and Hong Kong, and I think my you-know-what doesn't really smell, I'll take you back in time to 1996. 1996, I put up a 4-page website. 1996, October. This was a blog, my first blog. No audience, no contacts, nothing at all. Just putting curiosity out there. And plugging at it. I think people need to also keep in mind that if you are coming from one of those situations like you described, let's say somebody's really at bottom. Okay, well, anybody who's at bottom can create a 4-page website. Anybody who's at bottom can educate themselves to something they like, something that they find interesting. YouTube is a hell of a free resource. So I think ultimately that option still exists completely. That if somebody wants to build a brand, they want to build a platform, they want to go fishing, so to speak. Because if you build a brand and you build a platform and you get good at giving information or insights or analysis on something that you like, you're going to find people and they're going to find you. But you got to do the work too. If you're starting at that ground level and you're going to go fishing, you might not get people coming to your blog right away. You might not get people coming to your podcast right away. You might have to keep writing and writing and writing till your writing gets better. You might have to keep talking and talking and talking until you know how to talk. Ultimately, you get some experience and then people are going to pay attention. And they pay attention because some moment of serendipity happens where all of a sudden somebody tweets one of your blog posts or they tweet your podcast that was only getting 5 listens a month and it gets tweeted and then all of a sudden you get 1,000 listens. And that stuff can happen. But again, back to the mindset point, you got to believe all this is possible or it's not possible.
That hits the nail on the head in terms of that. A lot of times we might think in terms of constraints. We might think in terms of, oh, I don't have the budget to do X, Y, Z. Or to your point, nowadays, how cheap it is to put a website up, all the traditional barriers to putting yourself out there in a way are not really there anymore, right? In a virtual world where you can put yourself out there like this. And I think I'm a big fan of this organization in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, Reconstructed Living Labs, because they essentially, in the roughest of environments, with absolutely no budgets, they do this low income education business model where essentially they go into a community, train the trainer in terms of, hey, this is 5 ways of how you can do social media. This is 5 ways of how you can build your business. So very easy kind of education modeling. But what they're really good at is to say, when we go into a new community, we don't assume that people need something. We don't assume that we need to write a check. What we assume is that there's a lot of things already here. Like if I see an old garage, that could be a potential training center. If I see a former drug dealer, well, that person will have a lot of social capital. And if I can turn them around, they will be extremely resourceful and they will be extremely kind of social capital heavy and so on. And by looking at the world that way, by looking at the world in terms of what is already here, and then what can I do with this? I think that beautifully comes to what you mentioned earlier, that you always then realize, oh, okay, this is something I can do in this moment that is just possible. And I think then serendipity starts to happen in that context of Reconstructed Living Labs, where theoretically they don't have any opportunities. The birth lottery was completely against them. But even they, in those contexts, still find some kind of serendipity because they start creating their own luck by looking at things differently, by looking at people differently, not as a former drug dealer, but as a potential teacher. And philosophically, I think that is at the core of it, that once we start seeing what something could be, we actually start making it possible. And I think it's the beauty of serendipity.
You seem to be opening this up. Because if I think about a teacher, or I think about, let's say, an NGO or something in South Africa, I kind of imagine a group or individuals coming down to a level to try to bring people up. That's what I imagine is happening. That's the hope. But then on the flip side, you've got the individual who could also be pushing up. So I think that's the real challenge there, is that for me, at least in my personal experience, I think the best results from serendipity are going to come ultimately from the individual reaching up versus a teacher or NGO kind of with a scattershot approach to some degree, where you're trying to kind of come down to someone's level and bring them up. Your book title has got the word mindset in it. It seems like if we can have as many individuals as possible kind of having some kind of self-reflective moment to want this as well, to want this serendipity mindset, it seems like that's going to be more valuable in the long run than trying to bring people up to it. I think it's a combination of both. I think, though, that those that experience serendipity in a way where it happens to them on their own, it affects your DNA in a more intense fashion. Because when you do it, when you, so to speak, kill it and eat it, it changes you. I did that. There's some of that to it.
In particular, those contexts also, I feel the dignity that comes from realizing that you can do it on your own versus someone coming in. I will never forget the first time. So I started working in Kenya around 12 years ago. For similar reasons, actually, I think we have a lot in common there in terms of also the curiosity of just exploring different cultures and trying to figure out what's different, what's the same. And one of the first people I met, who's now a dear friend of mine, I asked him, what is the question I, as the kid coming in here into a new context, should never ask you? And he was like, well, never ask me what I need first. Never ask me what I need. Because if you ask me what I need as a first question, you assume that I can benefit, that I'm your beneficiary, that I'm the kind of victim here that needs to be helped. But if you come in and say, what is already here? What can we do together? You can still uplift and XYZ, but essentially we're doing it from a symmetric level. And to me, that really resonated because I think a lot of the development efforts that I've seen fail over the last years and decades are based on this premise that we have to kind of take someone out of a context and then pull them up. But actually, to your point, that's a very passive thing from the receiver side, because now I don't have the feeling that I created that own luck. So now if I'm the father or the mother in a family, I feel I failed because I didn't do that. Someone else helped my kid out. So it's really this kind of idea of how do we build these different structures that allow people in the local context to create that own luck. And I think that's where it gets interesting, where the mindset itself then goes hand in hand with structural changes around how do we develop, for example, scholarships that not only focus on getting someone into a good school, but essentially help them also develop these kind of networks that help them with it, develop the kind of mindset that comes with it, and so on. And that's why I'm so fascinated by exactly those questions around the education system and so, because I feel it has to go hand in hand with that kind of mindset development.
You bring up the examples in Africa. Of course, I know there is quite a bit of wealth in Africa, but there's also quite a bit of poverty. Quite a bit more poverty, for example, than the home country of yours, Germany, and the home country of mine, America. But what's really fascinating when I look at something like America is that we've got a situation in America where 50% of the population, 175 million people, receive some form of welfare. That's not a racial comment at all. That's white, black, everybody under the rainbow in America, 175 million people receiving welfare. So this whole notion of waiting for the something to come along versus kind of having that dignity to reach down and kind of pull the bootstraps up, so to speak. This is something that's a problem worldwide, not just necessarily on a continent like Africa, where we know there's some deeper problems, but in a so-called rich country like America, I mean, we've got a lot of folks that are waiting around for something to happen. And the thing they're waiting around for to happen is nowhere close to serendipity.
And I guess that's where it gets really interesting also in terms of what can we learn from those kind of resource constrained environments. If we can say that someone who in Kenya's Kibera context, where it's literally the poorest area in the world, what are the models that seem to work there where the local community works together with the government, with others, rather than just the government trying to do XYZ initiative or doing other things? And to me, that comes a lot to exactly the question, what are actual inclusive ways that are community driven, that are really driven by locals, rather than us setting some kind of parameters and giving resources, and then exactly the point, not really allowing for the local community to really develop something sustainable on their own. And I think that is really mindset shift also, I think, in terms of how we look at, if we look at a troubled community, I mean, here in New York, for example, where you have several parts of the city where it is getting slightly scary how much is happening in terms of crime and everything else. And if we kind of would learn from those contexts and say, you know what, at the end of the day, what is this all about? This is all about essentially people fighting for ways to be heard, fighting for ways to be a viable part of society, but people channel their energies in different ways depending on which outlets we have and that people are aware of. And I think what I've just been fascinated by in those kind of extreme contexts is that I think there's a lot of models we can learn from in terms of how, once we identify local community leaders and essentially turn them around as potential teachers, there's so much inspiration and hope that comes from that idea. Hey, if this person can do it, I can do it. And hey, here's a simple mechanism of how we can do it. And I think we are lacking a lot of times that interplay between developing local role models and helping them really thrive, and at the same time, simple mechanisms like this low-cost education methodology that essentially says, go out there and create your own luck. We are by your side. We have your back. And I think that kind of, in a way, I completely agree with you. We can learn a lot from those contexts.
Even if no one has your damn back, the serendipity mindset works. If no one has your back, grit works. And I think that's even a safer way, from my perspective, for people to approach it. Don't assume anybody has your back. Don't assume there's going to be a resource out there. Can you figure it out on your own? Can you pull it up? Can you reach down and pull those bootstraps up? I mean, look, this word serendipity is so great. Mindset is so great. I give you credit for putting the two into a title. I mean, those are two fantastic words. And I think that if the populations of this planet were to really find happiness, those two words are keys. Because once you understand serendipity and once you understand that your mindset, once you lock on to that right mindset, and once you believe that serendipity is there, man, you're unstoppable. you're unstoppable then.
One of the reasons why I've been so excited about this work is also this Mark Twain thing. When you will be looking back in 30 years from now, like, what is it that really kind of maybe has a kind of impact? And I think I've just seen that so often. And I think you've been a great example of this. Is having that mindset in a way brings up not only opportunity, but really this kind of joy and enthusiasm for life. And I feel in a period like at the moment where it's so much fight or flight reflex, it's so much kind of we're driven so by fear, ingrains itself in politics, it ingrains itself in so many other areas. So that mindset is about that individual change, but it's also about saying, how do we build societies that are more resilient, but also that have that kind of capacity to deal with uncertainty and everything else, not in a way that is then creating wars or creating all the fight or flight reflexes, but actually something that says, hey, look, that actually can be a way for us to really thrive. And so I think that is where a lot of my excitement for it comes from, to really say, at the end of the day, it maybe helps us create a more enlightened kind of capitalism, even because we go out with this mindset, to your point, that we can create our own luck, but also then we find opportunities to connect with others and do that in ways that are more sustainable maybe than others.
The book, Serendipity Mindset, The Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. I think we could probably share all kinds of examples and go down this path for a long time. It can be a tricky subject because, as we both know, the vast majority of people don't employ a serendipity mindset. In that sense, I hope they've been turned on in our conversation to explore more. I'm not so sure that people, even if they listen to me and you talk, I mean, some of this can be like, Mike said this example, he met Steve Wozniak, or Mike was giving a speech and something happened. Oh, whatever, that's just luck. They don't get the point of your book, which is, that's not really why it happened. It happened because somebody, it could be me, it could be anybody, somebody was navigating through the world with their eyes wide open. They'd had enough different experiences before to connect certain dots. And then when another dot happens, they connect it and they go down that path. They might not be a damn plan in the world. They just go down the path and something happens. And when you get rewarded for that something that happens by going down an unplanned path, man, your DNA is screwed. You can't go back. You're done.
If it wouldn't have been Steve Wozniak, next time it would have been Jeff Bezos, to your point. It's essentially, when we look at our kind of CVs and try to kind of trace things back, it's exactly what you say. We see isolated examples as, oh, but that was so improbable. It was very improbable that you would run into Steve Wozniak. But because you're creating these moments, you will create more of those moments. I wouldn't be surprised if you would have that moment again with Jeff Bezos or someone else in once the world opened up again. I think that's exactly the interesting thing. Once we get into that mindset that we realize, yes, the stories are very unique. The stories are very unique to who you are, who I am, and everything else. But then essentially the idea that there are these different types of situations that we create all the time essentially make it much more likable that these kind of constellation will happen again with whatever other type of person, and that is shaping our life.
And I look at this crazy podcast. I mean, I started this thing in 2012. If somebody goes down the roster of my 900 plus episodes, I mean, who in the world ever expects to talk to all of those different names, all those different experts, all in assorted fields? I mean, it's just, the whole thing is serendipity. None of it makes any sense. None of it's planned. You just wake up one day, next thing you know, now I'm talking to you, Christian. I mean, that's just the way it works.
I feel there's so much in there also. So for people who are maybe easing themselves into that area in terms of saying, hey, look, how do I sit down, and delighted to learn more also when we have a debrief or so in terms of your own kind of, sense of direction or so, because it feels like you've been intentional in some ways around creating content and going into a certain direction, and then extremely open to the unexpected where it leads you. And I feel when we do a lot of our work with senior executives, a lot of times they have exactly this mix between, if I'm running MasterCard, I have an idea that I want to lift 500 million people into the financial system by giving them access to the credit system. But at the same time, I don't know exactly how that will work. I will have to run into Hilda in Cape Town to then learn what way could be most exciting. And I think that is essentially what makes it interesting, that if you look at people like Paul Polman, people from the outside think, oh, he's always distracted. He's always running Unilever and he would always do new projects. And people would say, is he really focused? And he actually was extremely focused. He was extremely focused on his North Star and on his sense of direction of saying, I want to help people who can't help themselves, and I want to use this platform to do that. If you come unexpectedly to me with a thing that relates to that, let's make it happen. If not, I'm sorry, I will say no. And I think that is also beautiful as a filter, right? To really say, we can't take on all the unexpected opportunities that are coming our way, But if we have this sense of direction, it helps us connect the dots towards that. It makes it even more joyful and sometimes leads us into a completely different direction. And that's beautiful too. But it's really kind of that intersection that's so interesting.
Again, the book, The Serendipity Mindset, the Art and Science of Creating Good Luck. Christian, where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them? Is there a website?
Absolutely. So the website is theserendipitymindset.com. And my Twitter is Chris Serendip. I'd be delighted to connect in the spirit of serendipity. Please do reach out on LinkedIn, Twitter. I'd be delighted to see if there's potential opportunity and serendipity in those interactions as well.
Thank you very much, sir. Fun chatting. Now, this conversation is why I do my podcast. Now, don't get me wrong. I love all my guests, but it's one of those ones where it's something from perhaps my youth that I was always curious about, and I never expected to have a conversation with Michael Jordan's personal trainer. In fact, my guest today, his very first pro athlete client as a trainer was one Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player who has ever played. And I got to tell you, Tim has some fantastic lessons about life, even how he made his way to be at Michael Jordan's doorstep, that very first meeting. Wow. A little bit of luck, but also a lot of taking a chance, putting himself out there. And that's just how he got to Jordan. But those lessons he learned along the way, those winning lessons, he is here today to share a little with all of us. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Tim Grover. You've got about, I think, looking at ages, you've got about 4 years on me. So I want to take you back in time. I'm going to go a little fishing here in the beginning. I want to take you back in time to 1982. At that point in time, I was living 15 miles from Washington, D.C. I was a rabid Georgetown fan. My father went to Georgetown, and I sure as heck did not want that team in baby blue to win down at UNC. I loved watching that guy named Michael Jordan, but I did not want that team to win. When I think back to the physical shape, and I can still remember, look, he was a young guy. He was a freshman in college, but the Michael Jordan as a freshman in college was not the one that you ended up remaking physically, huh?
In college, he was 197 pounds. After our years of work, he was all the way played between 213 and 218.
Do you remember watching that game?
Yes, of course. Everybody watched that game. I mean, there was something about him that was just, I won't say different. I think that word is used too often. There was something unique about him. And then hearing how all the different coaches described him and his work ethic and his preparation and his different mindset and his detail to the game. So it didn't surprise me the way his career ended up being and him being able to take that shot during that moment as a freshman and make it.
Maybe you're right. Different is overused, but to win the national championship as a freshman, kind of a rare thing for people that know something about college basketball.
Yeah, and never hesitated when he took that shot. Just like, all right, here it is. Ball came to him, saw it was open, stepped into it, hit nothing but net.
When did you guys first meet up? Let's get granular and tell that story, the setup. How did it happen? Because obviously that changed your life to have that meetup, huh?
It did. No question about that. I actually started with him in 1989. He'd already been in the league, 4 or 5 years?
He had a 63-point game against the Celtics. He'd already been doing some big stuff.
Oh, he'd been doing some special stuff. I mean, listen, one of the coaches after 4 games into his rookie year said he's already the best player in the NBA. He had already been doing some special things, obviously his rookie year. And then the second year, he had the foot injury. Then he came back for the big game that you just mentioned and had a lot of individual success up to that point, but had never won the championship. I was working at a local health club during that time. My education is I have a master's degree in exercise science and a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. I always knew I wanted to train professional athletes. So there was a small article in one of the local papers saying how Michael Jordan's tired of taking a physical abuse from the Detroit Pistons. He's looking to bulk up. All right. So what I did was I was like, okay, there's no way the organization is going to hire an individual who's never worked with a professional athlete or outside to work with him. So what I did was like, all right, if I can get in with some of the other players, then there's a chance he could see my results and maybe he'd be interested somewhere down the line. So what I did was back then, remember, no emails, no text messaging, very few cell phones. They had the big ones with a backpack on them. So it wasn't the ones that fit in your pocket. So I did was I wrote 14 letters to every single player on the Chicago Bulls organization, handwritten letters, put them in a mailbox, hoping they would get to the players. So what happens is when you send letters to athletes in that time, they get thrown in a pile of fan mail. So every athlete, if you put their name on it, somebody in the back puts them in the person's locker and say, okay, here, and then it's the athlete's decision whether they want to open it or not. Well, obviously somebody opened one of my letters. I still don't know who it was. And it was sitting in another player's locker. And Michael saw this letter in somebody else's locker and reached for it and pulled it out and told the team athletic trainer and the team physician at the time, hey, he said, find out what this person is about.
Oh, come on, really? Is that true? Come on, really?
That's how this happened.
Serendipity.
The one person I didn't send a letter to was him, because I was like, okay, it doesn't make any sense to send a letter to him because there's no way the organization is going to let me work with him. There's no way he's going to be interested in working with me. So I just said, I'm not even going to send him a letter. So then the team athletic trainer and the team doctor both called me and they said, hey, we have somebody who's interested in your services, which was very unique because during that time, training was always kept in-house. Nobody hired anybody outside.
What was in this letter? You just stopped Michael Jordan 5 or 6 years into the league. He sees a letter randomly, doesn't know you from Adam, and he then gets the Bulls to find you. What was in this letter?
It explained who I was and what I did. And the key to the letter was, and I talk about this in the book, Winning, everybody would tell him what to think. This is what the books say. This is what's going on. Here it is, and so forth. I wrote some stuff in there on things that you wouldn't find in studies, you wouldn't find in books about training. I said, hey, listen, I have different methods, different ideas, different thoughts on how an athlete should be trained. And I just put a couple of examples in there, nothing detailed, but just a couple of things that were different than what everybody else. So obviously something in that letter caught his eye, because when you look at him now, so many years later, when you watched him play, his game wasn't just about what to think, it was how to think. He was very fluent in his movement. He really trusted his instinct. He was so well prepared. My thought process was kind of the same, not knowing that's going to be the edge that got me there. So that's, in my estimation, I've never asked him what was it about that letter. Put it another way, knowing his competitiveness, he could have been simply, why in the hell did I not get a letter? Why did everybody else get a letter, but not me? So here I'm telling you this elaborate story about what I think it is, and it could be something very simple as like, oh, what's this guy think I'm not good enough? For 3 months, we went back and forth. They put me through a bunch of practical exams, a bunch of written stuff to make sure I knew what I was doing. So 3 months time passed. I still didn't know who they were preparing me for. So then they said, hey, here's the address. We want you to go meet the client at 1:30. They still didn't tell me who it was. So they gave me the address. I went over there. This was before the big gated house. You could just walk up to the house. So I rang the doorbell once, no one answered, rang it twice, no one answered, rang it a third time. And Michael Jordan opens up the door.
Obviously, you were pretty well grounded to be writing that letter, the content of that letter, but there still must have been this interesting euphoria that you had to temper in that moment, didn't you?
Well, you know what? I'm not a starstruck person. That's the one thing. At that moment, that was very advantageous for me. Listen, I admire what they do. I know how hard they work to get to those areas, no matter what line of work they're in, but I'm not a starstruck individual. So I was just like, all right, here's an opportunity. Even though he was the one individual I did not really prepare for as well as I prepared for the other individuals. But since he was on TV so much, just like you described, there was so much emphasis put on him since that shot. So it was easy to understand and gather information about him and watch his game and what he did. So that was already kind of innate in my head to see what he needed to work on and what he didn't need to work on. He invited me in the house. Well, the first thing before I walked into the house, I had Converse gym shoes on, so we know that wasn't going to work. So I had to take those shoes off. So we went inside the house. We talked for about 45 minutes. I explained my philosophy to him, what my ideas and thoughts were. He was all about, he goes, I need to get bigger. I need to get stronger. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's down the line. These are the things we need to address right now. And he was the first individual that probably came at him and didn't allow him just to dominate the conversation and say, hey, this is what I want. And I was like, no, this is, in order for this to work, this is what we need to do. And the things I told him that were more important was, he's going, I want to be more athletic. I want to be explosive. I want to be more stronger. I want to be able to do these things. So what I said, well, you have some injuries. You have these little nagging injuries that come all the time. Your ankle injuries, groin strains, your hamstrings. I said, let's address those things. If we address those things, you'll automatically be stronger. You'll automatically be faster. You'll automatically be able to jump high. You'll automatically be a better basketball player. So imagine your body functioning at an optimum level. So he goes to me, this doesn't sound right. I said, it doesn't get any righter. I said, give me a chance. Let me prove what I can do. We never discussed money. We never discussed any of this. He goes, I'll give you 30 days. And 30 days turned into 15 years.
Of those 30 days, how many days per week were you getting?
Every single day that they had practice or a game, I was with him.
For the average Joes out there, they're kind of curious. I mean, obviously, whatever a training program you get for one of the world's greatest athletes is not going to be the average Joe training program. What did you start to do in those first 30 days that got him hooked? Was it particular exercises? Was it the mindset talk? What was it? Was it just you? What got him hooked on your direction?
What got him hooked was I told him exactly how he was going to feel and where he was going to feel things 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, 96. I was telling him exactly, hey, this is what your mind and body is going to feel during these times. When we do this particular exercise, this is what we're going to do. This is how your body's going to feel. This is what you're going to be able to do on the court. This is what's going to be a little bit difficult here. This is the time you're going to have to adjust your shot. So all these things were laid out. It was kind of like already telling him what the future was going to be as it related to his body, so he could make the adjustments that were necessary. And when we do this exercise, you may feel here. We do this, your ankle is going to have a lot more mobility here. When we do this thing, your hips are going to open up more over here. And also the program that I did it wasn't conventional to what everybody else would do. Normally you see people in gyms and when they work out, I'm just going to use a shoulder press movement for an example. You'll always see if they have 30-pound dumbbells in one hand, they're going to have a 30-pound dumbbell in the other hand. And I would hand him different weights in different hands and have different reps for one side versus the other. Because I would say, listen, one side is already overused when you constantly play. This is the direction. So now we need to focus in more on the other side. You have a strength deficit on this side. So we need to use more weight on one side, less weight on the other side. And the same thing with his legs. So stuff that was actually still is unconventional to this day. He started to see the results quickly. And with me being able to tell him, hey, this is how you're going to feel. And him, okay, well, this guy actually knows what he's talking about.
You're a guy in your 20s at this moment in time, right? What, mid to late 20s?
Yes.
And so is he. He's got a couple of years on you, I think, if I'm right. And you said you wanted to train pro athletes. Was he your first pro athlete?
He was my first professional athlete.
This is the craziest story, Tim, right? It really is. This is the craziest story. What I love about it is the letter part, man. That's what people don't understand. I did a bunch of that kind of stuff and met some really interesting people from a similar technique. And people just don't understand that idea of just you having that self-confidence to go give it a shot. Yes, there's some serendipity and it's fortuitous that Michael spotted it, but still, you had to take action.
You have to take action. No one's paying attention to you unless you take action. I have this thing that says, hey, what's the one thing that hasn't gone up in price in the world? Talk. Talk is cheap. It's always going to be cheap. It's the action you put behind that talk. It's the action you put behind your studies. It's the action you put behind your education. It's the action you put behind the action that allows you to get closer to winning. And it was just like, hey, I saw the opportunity. This is what's going to happen. And okay, you know what? I had rather given it my best during this opportunity to try to get whatever was available than to not have even sent those letters and found out somebody else who either sent those letters or ran into them by accident, ended up having the career that I ended up having. That regret would have hurt me more than me not getting the opportunity to work with him, but I know I did everything possible to get to that area.
I still remember your name coming up back in the day, but it was all secretive. Everyone kind of knew that Michael Jordan had this trainer. There was no leaks. No one knew what was going on. It was all kind of like this, who's this guy, Tim, this mystery thing, Jordan's great. Who's the trainer? What's going on?
I didn't speak to the media. I knew my role. My role was like, listen, obviously back then there was no social media, but even if there was social media, I would have not been that person. You could see that even on my social media, it's very rarely do I post anything about my clients unless they either tell me to or that there's a reason behind it. To me, the best endorsement you can get is when your athlete talks about you, whenever that is. If he's ever asked, let him explain. My job is to be that person behind the scenes, keep him as healthy as possible, keep as strong as possible, keep functioning at the highest level, let his results speak for my work. I would just show up, I would do my job. And Michael always had this saying later on in his career, when other athletes would ask if they could work with me, he would say, hey, he goes, listen, I don't pay Tim to train me. He goes, I pay him not to train anyone else.
I caught you saying that on the Skip and Shannon show the other day, and I thought it was great. How quickly did you get beyond with Michael? And I want to talk a little Kobe and perhaps some other clients later in the conversation, but how quickly did you get past only the physical with Michael to the winning mindset conversations with Michael? How did that unfold?
Well, obviously I had to build a trust. He was extremely competitive. He had his thought process. So people come in as a quote unquote trainer expert. They try to throw everything at an individual. I've always taken things into pieces. I was like, okay, let's figure out something about, let's master one concept first before we delve into the other, So the mindset actually was the last thing I wanted to address. First thing was the physical part. The second thing was the nutrition part. Then the third thing was the mental aspect. As I saw him mastering the physical aspect of it, then we started to put more emphasis on the nutrition part. We started to add that component in there. Then we started to drip the mental component in there. And what I would do is I would watch him. I would watch his body language. I would see I'd ask him how his practice and what went on, because I didn't work for the organization, so I didn't have access to all the practices. So, hey, what happened in practice? He would tell me, hey, how'd you handle this situation? Man, he goes, man, you ask a lot of questions. Yeah, I said, it's important for me to ask these questions so I can get a better understanding of what's going on in your head. I'd watch how he handled the media. I'd watch how he did after a win, after a loss, his tone, how he talked to different teammates. I would ask him questions. Hey, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? And he would tell me why he did certain situations. I would keep notes of those things. I would point out things like he would handle a situation one way, and I would see how this teammate played and reacted the following game. Then if he handled that same situation in a different way, how that teammate played and handled. And I would ask, hey, what did you say? What did you say to that individual? What did you say to that person? What happened here? And then I will point out, hey, this is the result you got. This is the result you didn't get when you handle this situation one way, when you handle a situation the other way. He would lose his temper in a certain game and how he would react towards the referees or what he would say. I would take and pinpoint everything that happened before and afterwards and see how the psychology of what was going on in his head and the different results he was getting with the different emotions, thoughts, and actions that were going on with all these different things going on. Everyone got a chance to see The Last Dance, and you got to see how competitive he was. So this wasn't always him learning from me. This was a lot of me learning from him and understanding that mindset of that individual, how important winning was to him.
If we keep it at the Pistons for a moment, a big roadblock in his success. And I remember watching all those games and all those series and, especially the early series where the Bulls could not overcome. And, those guys were, I don't want to say anything bad. I enjoy any team that can win. And that was a cohesive Pistons team and they could win, but they played a brand of basketball back there in the late 80s, early 90s that I think if the young kids today had to experience it, they might just run off the floor crying. Those guys they were rough and tumble, weren't they?
Yes, they were. They did whatever the rules allowed them to do. Here it was. That's what it was. And they knew there was like, hey, listen, Chuck Daly had a rule. He goes, don't let Michael get airborne. If he gets in the air, we're in trouble. So that was like, hey, knock him on the floor, knock him on his ass, do what he's supposed to do. Make sure every time he comes to the lane, there are many hands on him. Every time there's a foul, make sure there's another foul afterwards. You can't be called for 2 fouls. So there was a strategy that was put into place, and they knew that it's just like boxing. If you continue to take those blows over and over and over again, it is going to take an adverse effect. It is. We had to develop that body and develop those muscles, not to be like a Teflon shield where he could take those blows and not only take those blows, be able to dish it out. And then when the Pistons saw that those blows weren't having the same effect anymore, then the psychological advantage kind of turned to the Bulls' favor.
This winning mindset that you write about, it's so motivational. I mean, anyone with a pulse, even if they can't execute, even if they're just breezily going through your book, when you start to wrap your arms around this winning mindset, it really does energize you. And I think one thing, and I want you to run with this and explain to people, so much we hear in life is all about balance. Okay, you're going to be a super high achiever and you're going to have balance and all this other kind of stuff. How many super high achievers have you met with, quote, balance?
None.
There we go.
Plain and simple, none. And you said high achievers is right there. Now, you'll get individuals who have reached that pinnacle of achievement, and now they have other people doing stuff for them, or they've developed enough wealth or whatever winning means to them, and now they can balance their lives a little bit more because they don't have those things. But nobody wants to talk about the time those high achievers took to get there, how many years and hours and decades they may have sacrificed where they didn't have any balance. Because what happens is, like I said in the book, winning demands obsession, or it'll find someone else to consume. Winning wants all of you. There is no balance. Everybody tells you you need to have more balance. You need to have more balance. You don't find balance. That's the problem. You don't find balance. You create it. You create balance. And what you create balance, and your definition of balance could be completely different than somebody else's. What happens when people tell you you need more balance? Well, you start to add more. You start to add. Everybody says, oh, well, I need more balance. So I need to spend more time here, more time here, more time here. So when somebody says you need more balance, you actually become more unbalanced, because now you're trying to do all these things all over the place. It's like a juggler. I don't juggle, but I know it's a lot easier to juggle 3 things than it is to juggle 30 things. So when people tell you you need more balance, you kind of keep adding stuff, and that's not the way. How do you get closer to the balance that you want to create for yourself? It's not by the addition. It's by the deletion. It's by deleting the unessentials. This is deleting the unessential people in your life. It's deleting the unessential habits. It's deleting the unessential thoughts. It's deleting the unessential actions. It's deleting all these things that you need to do to be able to create that balance, what you want. Remember, time for everything equals time for nothing. Balance is personal. It is personal. You don't want those scales tipping all the way, but you have to decide how much, where it's going to be, how much you want them to tip, where that balance is going to be for that high achiever. There's not a single individual out there. I know it sounds good. I don't talk the rah-rah language. That's not me, because that's not what winning is about. Everybody wants to make it sound good, like you need to have balance in your life in order to achieve these things and all this other stuff. Your greatest winners, your most successful business people, your most successful teachers, your educators, your social workers, whatever it is, they have very little balance in their life.
You could not have known everything you knew back in the day when you first met Michael that you know today. He must have been very comfortable with the idea of betting on you, betting on your energy, knowing that you knew a lot at that moment in time, but he was also betting on, I'm assuming, that you were going to be a constant learner as well.
One of the first things he told me, he said, you better keep up. You better keep up. That wasn't keeping up with him in traffic. That meant keeping up with him in life, keeping up with how things moved, how he studied, how he learned, how his brand grew. It had to be the same way. He adapted to situations. He adapted. He adjusted. He overcame. We all had to do that. And if you couldn't, you were replaced often. And there was many people that were part of his circle that didn't stay in that circle very long because they couldn't keep up. They didn't adjust. They didn't adapt. And we knew every time he won a championship that you had to make another adjustment because he was going to make an adjustment. And after each championship, he would always come up to me and say, hey, what's next? Because he knew if he came back exactly the same and as good as he was, if he came back exactly the same, winning was not going to open its doors for him. It was going to be somebody else. So he knew he had to get better. We knew we had to get better. His training had to get better. His mindset had to get better. You know, his schedule, everything had to get better. Everything had to get a little bit better. We knew we had to figure those ways out. If we allowed him to figure those things out, then he isn't allowed to do what he does best. It was our job to figure those things out and implement those things. He put us in a position of trust. He said, I trust you guys to do this stuff. So make sure you get it done. Make sure you stay on top of things. And every now and then he would test. He would say, hey, did you hear so-and-so? I say, yes, I already know it. Or he'll be like, oh, this athlete is doing this. Or have you heard about this method? Already did the research on it, already got it. This is why we would use this. No, this is not, we're going to use this. This is why it's beneficial for this athlete, but it's not beneficial for you. And if we didn't know, this was extremely important with him, the part of being able to keep up. If we didn't know, we didn't guess. We didn't guess. We would say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Because if you're asking somebody a question, they don't need you to guess. They can guess on their own. Have the answer. If you don't know the answer, go find the answer out. Don't BS that person.
I want to go into a little Kobe in a second, but big picture wise, obviously you had a tremendous effect on what other people were seeing. Okay, they see Michael Jordan's results and people want to know who's the trainer he's working with. Speak to just big picture today across pro sports to the extent that you can or want to. How many pro athletes? I mean, the NBA is a pretty rarefied group. What, 300 guys maybe? I mean, these are some of the best athletes on the planet already. Some very natural, kind of born with it. Some work really hard at it. How many guys, or however you want to quantify this, where are we in terms of, if we look at the population of the NBA, guys that are employing the mindset and techniques that you have helped put forward? Do more guys today feel compelled to do it? Or is it there's still a rarefied air of people going all the way with the kind of mindset and techniques that you use?
Well, all the way, not many. There are quite a few players. Maybe every single player at some level is using some kind of outside coach, whether it be a skill coach or maybe a strength and conditioning individual. I'd say that's at a very high percentage. Whether that individual is adapting the program for that person, that I can't say. Now it's become more, who are the results aimed for? Because you get a lot of individuals that the first thing they do is before they even train a client, they already got a picture of that individual up on Instagram. Well, whose brand are you trying to build? Are you worried about the results or are you trying to build your own brand? What is it? And I understand the trajectory of how people do business now has changed and people want to get the information out there. But I always say, let the results speak for themselves. The mindset stuff is extremely difficult. And this is a good segue into talking about Kobe because everybody talked about the mama mentality. And I've said this to more individuals. I said, the mama mentality is not a mentality. It's a lifestyle. All right. And I've seen mama mentality destroy and hinder more careers than it's actually helped.
Define the Mamba mentality for those that might not be core basketball fans.
Mamba mentality is, in a nutshell, a no prisoner mentality. That's what it is. It's just when you're competing, nothing else matters. When you are in that, when you're in your competitive nature, whether it not only in games, whether it's in practice, whether it's just shooting free throws, whatever it is, you are so ultra focused that nothing else matters around you. It's to the point where you are so selfish about winning.
The zone, the flow state.
Yes, it's just those things. And you don't come down to anybody else's level. You make them rise to yours. You don't back down. It's a place where your mind is always stronger than your feelings. It's a huge thing over there. You understand? You don't say something nice to somebody because you don't want to hurt their feelings. It's like it's truth. It's 100% truth. They always want you to be honest until it's time to be honest with them. You get to a certain point in your career where people are afraid to say no to you, or afraid to say, hey, this is wrong or this is incorrect. There's better ways of handling certain situations. That's what Mamba mentality is. So people love to say it. They love to hit like one basketball shot or throw one touchdown or whatever it is and say, oh, it's Mamba mentality. No, Mamba mentality, you don't talk about Mamba mentality. You just like, you go out there, you produce the results, you show what you're supposed to do.
What's the root of that in Kobe? Where did that start in him?
So what happened was he was going through a personal issue in his life at a certain stage in his career, and he wanted to create a separate alter ego identity to separate the two of what he was going on in his personal life and what was going on the basketball court. And I talk about this in the book, Winning, the movie Kill Bill. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie, but in the movie, there was an assassin named the Black Mamba. So obviously, if Kobe's looking at something, he's not going to name his alter ego after a garden snake. He's going to name it after the most venomous snake out there. He saw the idea there, and it kind of evolved into this thing of this personality of, when I step into practice, when I go to play the games, when I'm on the road, this is the mentality I need to have. When I step in between those lines, this is who I am. It allowed him to focus, like you said, be in that flow state and be that individual where it was no prisoners, no second guessing, knowing that in order to win, that he had to use his heart less. He had to use his mind more, not worry about other people's feelings, didn't care what anybody thought about how he played, what he said, and being able to constantly stay in that flow state that you were talking about.
I still remember some of those Boston series with Kobe. And as a Celtics fan, I was just like, damn, I grudgingly had to admit to myself, this guy is too good. I mean, he was just deadly. You had a nice setup on Michael, but speak to some of that one-on-one with you and Kobe. I mean, I'm not trying to compare and contrast. They've each got hellaciously incredible careers on their own, independently, just different stages and different generations and all that kind of stuff. Speak to your involvement with Kobe, perhaps a contrasted difference, something that was more unique in working with him.
The two biggest differences, I would say, was Michael had full trust in me. It was just like, hey, I hired you, go do what you're supposed to do. I shouldn't have to question you. If I have to question you, just have the right answer, as I mentioned earlier. Kobe wanted to know everything. He wanted to know every single detail. He wanted to know why we were doing this exercise, why we were doing this exercise in this particular order. Why am I eating this thing? Why do you have me taking a nap at this time? He wanted to know every single detail.
His questioning probably made you better, though, huh?
It did make me better. I don't mind that. If I'm going to challenge you, you have the right to challenge me. Every single thing. And here's the thing. If I can't explain to you why we're doing something and why I have you thinking this way, or why I have you eating something, or why I'm having you doing this exercise, why I don't have you doing this exercise, we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't be doing it. There's a reason behind every single thing. And that reason is to get you a step closer to your next win. Challenge me all you want. And this was a way for him also to see, am I developing a program that was a Kobe Bryant program and not what a Michael Jordan program was? Yeah, there were pieces and foundations that were crossed. He wanted to make sure I wasn't just taking what Michael did, because his body type was different. His gameplay, the way he played was different. I wasn't just taking what worked for one individual and trying to force it onto him. And he would ask, he goes, hey, did you have Michael do this thing? But I would say, yes, I had Michael do this. Or no, I didn't have him do this. Yeah, I had Michael do this way, but I'm having you doing this way. This is why I have you eating this. And I had Michael eating this because your metabolic rates are different in different stages of your careers and everything. This is why I want you thinking about these things. I had Michael thinking about other things over here. There was a reason behind everything.
God, the preparation, I can think back to when you first met Michael and then meeting Kobe, other athletes, but the preparation, I mean, you're not making it sound easy, but there is a heck of a lot of preparation for you in particular when you're dealing with individuals that are at this particular level. There's no faking it. I mean, you've got to be so prepared. I could just imagine you must have been burning the midnight oil, so to speak, in terms of your preparation every time you dealt with another high achiever in terms of professional athletes.
I burned through so much midnight oil, I think I might have caused some of the gas prices to go up. I had no choice. Going back to Michael early in his career, I always tell people I was the original Fitbit. So what I would do is I'd go to the game. I was blessed enough to go to majority of the games. I could watch the games, but I couldn't pay attention to the details that I wanted to. For our younger viewers, they're going to have no idea what I'm talking about here. There was these machines called Betamaxes and VHS recorders that you would actually record a game on. I would set that up to record the game. So then after the games, I would come home because I knew the workout for the next morning. I had to rewatch the game because I had to count all of MJ's steps. I had to count how many steps he took to the left, how many steps he took to the right, backwards, forward, sideways, how many jumps he did. Because if I didn't have that information, I wasn't prepared for the next workout tomorrow because I needed to know if one side was more fatigued than the other, that the right knee and the right ankle and the right hip take more stress than the left, and what parts there was a part that he fell, and how did, what happened after that. So I literally would come home, it would be about a midnight, sit there, watch all the games again, do all the details, and then have to be back at Michael's the next morning, depending on what time the workout was. And the workouts were usually at 5 a.m., 6 a.m., or 7 a.m. So I would literally be going on anywhere from 3 to 4 hours sleep at the most.
I got a kind of a side tangent question here before I bring it back to something that Kobe said. But in working with pro athletes, especially, let's say, the NBA guys up and down the court, who knows how many miles they're running in a game, is it possible for these guys to get to their 50s and 60s and still be not physically damaged? They're giving it all during their 20s and 30s, and it's kind of like no prisoner, and they kind of lose something.
100%. If you see a professional athlete in their 50s and 60s, listen, obviously stuff is changing now, but still, if you've given it all for 15, 20 years, there is going to be a body part or body parts that you're not going to be able to walk straight. Your fingers aren't going to be straight. Your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, your knees. There is going to be a detriment to something physically. If you're giving everything you got, if you're literally playing and practicing at the highest level. I have some of the top conditioned athletes that played the most amount of games in their career. And I don't have not one that doesn't have a issue after they retire. The crazy part about all this is we paid particular attention to all the areas that have a tendency to get injured. We paid attention to the ankles. We paid attention to the wrists, the fingers, just things that nobody else would think about. There's still physical issues with them.
I love this line from Kobe. It's on the first page of your book, and I don't think I've seen it before. I mean, I guess I should have seen it before, but rest at the end, not in the middle. And that gets back to some of the mindset stuff at the beginning of our conversation. But I thought that's a good philosophical jumping off point as you and I wind down. Rest at the end, not in the middle. I guess a lot of people can interpret that in many ways. Why don't you give the Kobe interpretation and you can add some context and color to it?
Well, you know what? This fits in real good with the second to last chapter in the book where it says winning's not a marathon, it's a sprint with no finish line. A lot of individuals think they have the luxury of taking their time. You don't have the luxury of taking your time. You just don't, because time is something that we have no idea when it's going to be taken away from us. So when you get a lot of individuals that just kind of like are in cruise control, oh, yeah, you know what, I got time, I'll have time to figure this out and so forth. Those individuals are constantly managing time. They're the individuals that manage time. The one thing we did with all our athletes and the whole idea about resting at the end and not resting in the middle, start managing focus. Because when you start managing focus, you have so much more time. Oh, just think about when you're in that state where you're so focused, how much more you can get done during that time when you're managing that focus instead of managing time. And people that manage your time all the time, they love to rest in the middle. They're always like, oh, it's a break time here. I can take a little. Now, I'm not telling you, listen, You need to rejuvenate. You need to get distracted a little bit. You need to let the mind rest. You need to re-energize physically and mentally. But don't stay in that rest state for a long period of time. The people that stay in that rest state for a long period of time don't have the ability to finish. They don't have the ability to win because they have a tendency to get comfortable. We used to talk about this all the time is, everyone says, it's about the journey. Yeah, it is about the journey, but the journey has to have a destination. It has to have a destination. These individuals, they enjoyed the journey, but each one of their journeys had a destination. And that destination allowed them to rest at the end of that journey because they knew the next journey was going to start back up again. So for individuals that are out there, if you want to put something together with that line where it says, hey, rest at the end, not in the middle, start managing focus and stop managing time.
What's so cool about your work, your book, your books, several books, is that this winning mindset, too many people, maybe they get out of high school and they move into just a regular job or whatever, and they lose the feeling of what winning is about. They don't have anything in their life where they're competing still. It's like the spring unwinds. The only reason I wake up every day is I'm chasing a win. I'm chasing a win. If I'm not chasing a win, what am I doing? I mean, I wake up every day energized to work on the stuff that I'm working on. I am chasing a win every damn day, every day. I can't turn it off. But I think too many people, and you know this more than I, too many people lose that. They don't have it. I do think your book is a great reminder of folks that, and regardless of how old they are, I love finding those YouTube videos of there's two guys like 100 years old running 100-meter dashes in under 20 seconds.
Oh, I love those things too. Yes.
Those are great. That stuff is great, Speak to that issue though, of like people that perhaps think, well, I'm past it. I can't do this. I mean, they really can do it. They just need a swift kick and then you know what?
Those individuals, and this happens at a lot of stages in people's lives. When did you quit? When did you give up? What made you give up? What made you quit? That's what you have to address. That's what you have to address because the ability to win is in all of us. Winning is everywhere. It's every minute you have the opportunity to win. I also think a lot with everything that's been going on in the world these last year and a half, 2 years, whatever it was. People forgot what a win looks like. They forgot what it feels like. They've forgotten and they've gotten comfortable. They've gotten comfortable making excuses. They've gotten comfortable blaming somebody else. They're looking for their wins to wear a halo all the time, and winning doesn't wear a halo all the time. A lot of the times it comes at you with fangs. Just like what you said, you get up every single morning excited. You get up every single morning excited to, hey, listen, what's the next win I can get? You're not looking for steps. You're not looking for the easiest way. You're not looking for 5 easy steps to get this win or 5 steps to greatness. You're not looking for 10 steps to super mindset. Those individuals that lose it, they're constantly looking for the easiest way. They're constantly looking for that one thing. How many times, Michael, do you get asked all this time, if you could give me one piece of advice? God, don't we wish it was that easy if it's just one piece of advice. Those pieces of advice are infinite. Those steps are also infinite. They're constantly shifting. They're constantly changing. Sometimes you see them under your feet. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you can't even walk up those steps. What happens is the ones that give up, they're looking to constantly walk up those steps, or they're looking for an escalator to carry them. And they just don't understand that sometimes you got to sit on those steps. You got to crawl on those steps. You got to fall down those steps. So they're just like, you know what? I just don't want to do this today. And then today turns into tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day. Winning requires you to show up every single day. It doesn't care about what happened yesterday. It could care less what had happened a year ago. It could care less about what happened 10 years ago. And too many times people get comfortable and they use their surroundings, their environments, their past, their present situation as excuses that allow them to put themselves in a comfort zone of always being a victim instead of being the victor.
Someone can't win for you. You've got to go win it. You can't hire someone to win for you.
Your obligation has to be greater than anybody else's obligation to you.
The book, Winning, The Unforgiving Race to Greatness. motivational stuff. It's nighttime for me here in Asia, so now you've got me all jacked up. I will not be able to fall asleep.
Where are you?
I'm in Saigon, Vietnam.
Oh my goodness. How long you been there?
8 years. I was randomly living in San Diego, got invited on a speaking tour for one of my books, and I loved Asia. And I said, well, gosh, I was in 20 cities in a 3-month stretch, and I had the most fun in Saigon. So I said, I'm going to stay.
That's winning. That's winning. That is. How many people have come up to you and says, man, I could never do that. Or like, man, I wish I could do that. Well, why didn't you? You did it.
I think you make an interesting point there, and I'm sure you could compare it to many other things. When it happens, you have to go. When it's go time and you see it, you can't hesitate. You must take it. Like you said, okay, you'll get too comfortable. You forget about it. You make excuses, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a great point, and I'll end with this. In the book, you said, listen, we're all going to have fear, but you can't have doubt. You had fear. You're like, do I really want to do this? But you didn't have any doubt that it was the right situation to you. Winning requires you to have no doubt.
That's a great one. Again, the book, Winning, The Unforgiving Race to Greatness. Tim, the book is everywhere, all that kind of fun stuff. Lots of great interviews that I've seen with you for this book. Where can we send people? Is there a website you want to direct them to?
I'm the easiest person to find. My website is timgrover.com, and my Instagram is @TimGrover.
Tim, cool stuff. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.